Okay, so I guess today I'd like to start by highlighting or more exploring some observations about the current IFC certification process, which of course uses BCert. And in addition to these observations, I also want to talk about some industry trends that I'm noticing around IFC and how these trends sort of inform or reveal some opportunities for the certification process to be a bit more accessible or transparent for the industry. So before I begin, a quick intro, not so much who I am. My name is Dion, but more importantly, what angle I'm going to be looking at this certification from. So I come from an architectural background, and I work for a firm called Lend-Lease, and Lend-Lease is one of those big international companies, and they're basically a managing contractor. And what this means is that I'm not really coming from the perspective of a vendor. I'm coming from the perspective of certification from the user of IFC. You know, we receive a lot of IFCs, we create a lot of IFCs, we do a lot of IFC analysis and manipulation. And software certification is typically a vendor thing. But in today's talk, I want to focus more on the viewpoint of how a user sees certification. But at the same time, I will also look at it from the perspective of a vendor. As some of you know, I contribute to some free and open source software like IFC OpenShell, and in particular, the Blender BIM add-on component of it, a little bit to FreeCAD and some other smaller utilities such as IFC Diff, IFC Clash, IFC CSV. And the reason I'm describing this is because the tools I'm contributing to have very different audiences. Some are libraries aimed at developers or power users or scripters. And at the other spectrum, we have fully fledged 3D graphical authoring apps to create and consume IFCs. And others are in between, like data extraction or utilities or middleware. And the reason why this is important is because the vast majority of the software that I contribute to has no Building Smart software certification. And there is no certification that actually applies to it. And even the ones which are full authoring environments, kind of like what we expect traditional BIM apps to do, it cannot easily be certified. And there's a number of reasons for this, which I'll go into more detail later on. But this is highlighting that there is an opportunity for improvement on the certification process, both from a user perspective as well as a vendor perspective. So I'll start with how certification works as it is now. And the whole point of certification, I'd like to highlight, is not about certifying software vendors. That's just a means to an end. And the end goal is really to benefit users, because the certification is meant to act as a guarantee that the software is capable of providing a useful IFC workflow for a user. And this is a great thing. You know, certification is a tried and proven tool for achieving this. And we all agree that we need certification. But from the user's perspective, the way that most users interact with certification is by this sentence. You know, this is the sentence which users understand certification. This was copy pasted from a contract, and this was copy pasted from another contract. And Lend-Lease gets a lot of contracts, and we write a lot of contracts, and we see this copy pasted sentence a lot. And we're probably not alone in Australia in seeing this. And this copy pasting behavior is because the people who write the contracts don't fully understand what the certification implies. And a lot of people who read the contracts also don't fully understand what it means. And this is a symptom of, I guess, a fundamental observation that the current certification process is not clear from a perspective of a user. It's not clear what the benefit is for this IFC2X3 Coordination View 2.0, what it brings. And we know that the certification, in theory, like we read the sentence, we know that it's a guarantee that it can be used to produce IFCs for coordination purposes. It says so in the name. But coordination is a really broad term. And the scope of coordination is really difficult to understand. And it's buried in this really highly technical documentation, this bespoke MVD XML dialect. And this makes it basically opaque to users. And the questions that users really want to ask are simpler things, not coordination, but simple things like, can I coordinate penetrations? Can I coordinate fire ratings? Can I do clash detection? Or maybe coordination means something else entirely, like, is the model optimized to be viewed on a tablet for site coordination? And all of us here are a technical audience. We know where to find the answers to these questions. We know the answers. We know where it's spelled out. But I guess this is merely saying there's an opportunity to improve the accessibility or the way certification is presented in a more transparent manner to make it more meaningful for a broader user audience. I guess another thing we can see from the statement is the term all software. We deal with a lot of software, and IFC has a huge amount of scope, and the coordination view calls out a huge amount of the scope. And this culling, or which software it applies to, is also lost in translation or miscommunicated to users. In an ideal world, what we should see in the contracts are many certifications for different software domains. Coordination view is one, but there should be many, many ones. But we don't see this. And I know, yes, in theory, there are all the MVDs and all that. And that's what I'm saying, that the theory and what users actually perceive, they mismatch. And this is an opportunity to improve, again, the transparency of how certification works for users. You'll also notice what's missing is import or export. And this is a bit odd because users understand import and export problems very, very well. And because most of them use traditional BIM software and they never interact directly with IFC. They only interact with this translation to and from IFC. And so we know that the software certification never actually certifies IFC itself. It certifies the translation process to and from IFC. But this translation system is very nuanced. It has usually this maze of configuration options and mapping tables, and we're all guilty of this. And it results in this kind of lossy translation and poor user experience. And there are so many permutations of all these options that the certification process or the guarantee cannot be replicated by the end user. So it's hard to say how useful the certification is if they cannot achieve or don't know the same options used to produce it. Then, of course, I guess this is talking about 2x3 and not 4. That's a big issue in itself, and we'll cover that a bit later. But I guess what I'm highlighting here is that there is a mismatch in a user expectation, a presentational problem with certification that I want to hope we can discuss together some opportunities to represent certification in a bit more accessible in a transparent manner. So now I'm going to switch and I'm going to look from the perspective of a vendor. And if a vendor come across the statement, they want to be certified. And one of the first things they come across is this table here. And it's an 11,000 euro price tag just to get started, and then it ramps up quite significantly from there. And this is an issue. I'll be quite blunt about this point, that this price point is cost prohibitive to smaller players in the market. It's cost prohibitive to academia, to developing nations, to free and open source software investment. And what's often overlooked is that there's all this in-house software development happening in larger architecture, engineering, manufacturing, or developer firms. And they're building open BIM software, but they're not software vendors. And so focusing purely on economics, just for the moment, I think this is one of the biggest barriers to entry for software certification. If somehow we could reduce this price tag, this would, it should increase the accessibility of certification. But there's a bigger problem to this price tag, is that the AEC industry is already highly monopolistic. And software monopolies are not conducive to open data standards like IFC because there's no motivation for interoperability. And so if you create such an expensive price tag, this reinforces the monopolistic behavior, as only larger vendors can afford to be certified. And I guess this is the evidence of what I've just observed. And this table lists who's certified for IFC4, and there's only a handful. There's only 6 entries over here. Compare that to the 350 software on the Building Smart implementation database. 350 is probably an underestimate. The database is missing a few. I name a few like Ogin or IFC.js, or even well-known ones like Graphisoft's Revit IFC add-on. And we have to ask ourselves, why is Building Smart certification rate so low? Why is it only 1 or 2%, 6 out of 350? And we already know that users love to copy paste this sentence. They love to require certified software, but clearly 6 out of 350 is not very practical. And there are governments doing this as well, governments who want to promote non-competitive behavior. And let's say that certification doesn't apply to a lot of the implementations in the implementation database. Why is that the case? Why are there so many IFC implementations that we are unable to certify, or it doesn't have a corresponding applicable certification program for it? Let's say we're implementing a library. Can a software library be certified? Should it be certified? How is it certified? What if we write a utility or middleware? Can a utility be certified? And I think these represent holes or opportunities where we can increase the scope of certification to more than the traditional domain-based architecture structural as MVDs, as you see here. And this scope thing is another thing to highlight, that what you only see here in this table is architectural and structural. MEP usually comes next, but there's also, as we know, FM, costing and scheduling, resources, project orders, project libraries. And I'd like to highlight that certification, yes, it's a tool that Building Smart has to encourage valid schema implementations, but certification can also have another purpose. It can be used to encourage adoption of the schema. And this is one of the strengths, I believe, of IFC, and it's quite unique compared to other open data standards. IFC has this tenacity to address this broad interdisciplinary relationship, all the disciplines sort of integrated together. So how can Building Smart use certification as a tool to address or encourage adoption of these other lesser known aspects of the schema? I'd like to point out the dates on this table as well, looking at the speed of certification. The earliest IFC4 schema release was in 2013. The certification for some of the MVDs started around 2017 to 2018. Then, so that's already a 4 to 5 year gap. And then you fast forward another 4 years, you have 6 entries in this table. And let's say in the next couple of years, this number jumps up significantly. And yes, there are a number already in progress, which are listed on this table. But this, it doesn't really matter, because the point is that it takes almost an entire decade to roll out certified software for an updated IFC schema version. And then we have things we can't really control, because once it takes 10 years to roll out, there's this glacial software release cycle that's part of the AEC industry, which means that'll probably get delayed another couple of years before users actually access the certified software. Some of the certified software is bundled separately. Users may not realize they're not using the certified version. You'll notice none of these entries show the version of the software that is certified or which combination of settings to achieve it. And what happens if a vendor then updates it? Is certification locked in time? It's not clear to users. What happens if there are regressions in the software? There are a couple more things, like on this table, you only see export, not import. And IFC, most people interact with it through translating instead of this kind of native IFC concept. And this makes it impossible for any user workflow to require IFC4 certified software, because we've only got one half of the coin. And then back to the point before I showed this table, which is software monopolies. Most of the certifications you'll see on this table are from well-resourced, well-established vendors. And yes, we need to encourage the growth of a diverse ecosystem of interoperable tools, not constrain it. And what's missing from this list are vendors and initiatives highlighted quite notably from the Building Smart Awards for technical excellence, innovation, or technology leadership, but even things like professional and student research. We might think about whether certification could be equally accessible to these initiatives rather than more entrenched solutions. Because if we don't consider this, what it means is that users are discouraged or even contractually banned from using these innovations. Even though we recognize they're great, they are not allowed to use it because it's specified in the contract. And so the development of interoperability is not promoted. So I guess this is a rather unstructured way to explore the variety of issues I'm or things I'm observing with the current certification process from both perspectives, both from a user and a vendor. I've listed some of them here. And I think this is a good thing we can start discussing about some opportunities for improvement. But I think the vast majority of these issues are just symptoms, boiling down to the fact that the certification process right now is a black box. And I think we need to open this up. We need to explore how to make certification more accessible and transparent, and do this with the end goal in mind. Can we guarantee to users that certified software delivers a useful domain-specific workflow? But I now like to talk about some trends that we need to be aware of when we look at how to tweak the certification process. And the first trend is that the accessibility of open data is growing. Building Smart, no doubt, has seen a huge increase of implementations. And it's not just an increase, it's in quantity, it's a growing diversity in a range of user interfaces and technologies through which users access IFC. So there was once a time when the only way you interact with IFC is indirect. You do it through a controlled translation using a graphical app, but this is no longer the case. So here's a list of software which exposes IFC to an increasing number of programming languages, APIs, and parsable serializations like JSON and XML. Most of these are free or open source or low cost. They have low-level C++, high-level Python, web-based JavaScript, less common things like Perl. They're cross-platform. And the fact is that users are learning how to code. For those who don't, there's visual programming, there's spreadsheet interfaces, and there's no-code applications emerging. And these libraries, these lower-level libraries, is the calm before the storm of user-created scripts, apps by non-software vendors, indie developers, power users, and a black box certification process cannot keep up with this growth. We might even say that a centralized certification process doesn't have enough resources to keep up with it. The tools are here already. Users are getting more and more savvy. It's almost inevitable that this will grow, and it will grow really fast. We'll expect fast release cycles. So the speed of certification is incredibly important. We can't do 10 years anymore. And these new, I guess, so-called vendors, or indie vendors rather, they are unlikely to afford expensive certification. So we have to make certification faster, and we have to make it cheaper. And it's not just the growth. The nature of these technologies are very different to traditional BIM. These new software typically will start reading partial IFC data, not whole things, or writing or changing existing portions of IFC data. And this nature of software is very different. It's not captured by the current MED-based certification scope. And if you don't certify, or we don't find a way to certify these things, we cannot guarantee that the interoperability still works. There's also this emerging concept of native IFC, which is the extreme of it, where users create IFCs directly. There's no translation from other schemas or data structures, which is kind of the natural progression as IFC gets more feature-rich and people get access to it. It's no longer necessary to switch to and from IFC. So because there's no import or export, the MED concept starts to apply less and less. This is in contrast to the more traditional translated IFCs. So this kind of new partial or native IFC manipulation might suggest a new form or category of certification to cater for it. So I'm going to propose a new series of approaches to certification. None of these are particularly fleshed out, so that's all right. We'll just, hopefully this will prompt some discussion and we can work it out together. And here are some of the principles I've tried to follow. Increased accessibility, otherwise its utility is limited. This will target some of those issues I talked about, like cost and speed and transparency. But also, I think certification should separate between things that are easy to check, like concrete syntax, and the more abstract domain-specific problems, which kind of truly add value for users. And a focus on the domain kind of make sure that certification is always designed for the end user, not just for software vendors. And kind of this more complex concept of decentralization of certification. And how do we break it up into increased granularity? And the point of this is I think it's a good way to deal with this growing complexity of this partial or native IFC manipulation. So I guess starting with IFC 101, I'm proposing that it would be a good idea to have this new category of certification for low-level concrete implementation stuff. Naturally, if we get this wrong, nothing else works. So this is just serialization checks. You know, is the step correct, the JSON correct, the XML, or even things like the MS SQL database or ODF for spreadsheet mappings for FM, for example. But it'll also check some things like step headers, XML namespaces, string encoding, validated character sets. These are all the basic assumptions that we all rely on. And this is not particularly difficult from a technical standpoint. But what I am proposing is that Building Smart makes all of these checks publicly available at zero cost. And we don't need to call it certification if that's not the right word. But it's important to get this out so that when people inevitably start creating their own data and writing their own scripts and using this growing ecosystem, they do it correctly. So what I'm proposing is a public Building Smart domain website. Anyone can upload their file or provide a database connection detail, and this can be checked. And another benefit of doing it this way is that it starts to promote usage of serializations other than STEP. So we can start exploring a few more interesting IFC systems rather than the STEP file. And I guess the next step for this, of course, is to provide a free and public validator that checks schema-specific aspects. So things like abstract classes, cardinality, data types, where rules. And I'm sure many of us have come through many issues where they think the software is broken and it's just the IFC dataset is, it doesn't meet these simple requirements. And sometimes people start editing the IFCs in a text editor, and they actually do this, and they're getting braver and braver in doing so. And so catching these problems, which we'll probably see a lot more in the future, is pretty vital. And there's nothing new really about what I'm talking about here. This is the W3C markup validation service. It's provided free of charge. It's got the same thing for CSS, JavaScript, and so on. Now, building a tool for this is not exactly easy from scratch. But the good news is that we can probably volunteer some existing tools. There'll probably be some shortcomings which we can fix and patch up and make that available for Building Smart. I don't really think there's a huge commercial advantage for that. So just giving it free for the entire industry is probably a good thing. IFC OpenShell, for example, has similar validation systems in it. XBIM also has similar ones. Naturally, using open source software for this is pretty typical. Here in the W3C's validator, you can see the code for it here. But here's an example which is a bit, I guess, closer to our industry. GBXML also has a validation system. As you can see there, it's got a web app and an API you can access as well. And this validator that GBXML provides is actually quite similar to what I'm proposing. You can see here they have an online dashboard. They've got different levels of certification. This is public, by the way, on the GBXML homepage. Anyone can sign up. You can use it for free. A level 1 certification does basic schema validation. It does this kind of smoke test. Make sure that you can view your GBXML online. The level 2 certification is kind of the next step after that. So after you've covered serialization and schema validation, they call it level 2. We can brand it whatever. It targets geometry. And we all know that geometry is really difficult in IFC. So test cases and public test suites for this are a very, very good thing. And we're already doing this, right? I mean, we're already doing these example test cases in IFC files. For example, the 4.3 alignment geometry. There's been a lot of back and forth with different test cases. And there's also been requests on the forum for geometry sample files, and especially for some of the tricky geometries. So there's a clear need for this. I guess it's just a matter of formalizing it into an automated test suite that everybody has access to. I mean, we already include some of this in the docs as well. It's just not kind of automated and formalized. So this is what I'm showing on the screen is the GBXML system. You can see on the top, they have this kind of 4-step process where you click your test suite. And if you move on to the next step, or I guess 2 steps ahead, you upload your geometry and it will render it online, and it shows the test results on the left with failures and successes. And of course, processing geometry is really tricky, and I don't think Building Smart, or I don't know, maybe they will build one from scratch, I'm not sure. But maybe we can work together and provide some shared resources for this. But I guess this will kind of help guarantee that this more white box nature of certification, and addresses things like the high cost barrier. You know, anyone can access it. Users can easily replicate the certifications or make sure that their IFCs are correct, because they'll start coming from all sorts of locations. And so I can imagine a very similar process to this GBXML system, where there are publicly available instructions and a public test server, so anyone can upload to it and see the results. So I guess now that we've covered the basic stuff like schema validation and syntax validation, which people can do instantly and for free, there's more complicated things like domain-specific certification. And the biggest problem with this is that the devil is in the details. There are so many caveats with or differences in the translation settings that make this monolithic certification method a little bit less useful for users. And users are less interested in whether it's certified, but whether it's practical to achieve the certified result, not whether you have to use a very specific workflow to do it. So I guess my proposal for this one is to break down certification into less monolithic and focus into small features, kind of designed around little portions of a user workflow, which at the end of the day, we can't fully predict their workflow. But if we predict common denominators or aspects of it, we can certify those little portions of it. And I think this also addresses the fact that a monolithic certification or of an MVD probably takes a very long time to author and stabilize. As you can, right now, for example, there's only one MVD that's in final status for IFC4. There's only 4 MVDs that are finalized for 2x3. And workflows, of course, are much more nuanced than this kind of handful of MVDs. So if we break down the certification, instead of a single reference view, we could break it down into fundamental concepts and certify per concept. So for example, if a project needs georeferencing, we certify just georeferencing. If a project requires quantity takeoff, we certify just quantity. If they need geocoding, we do geocoding. Construction types, and so on and so on. And so we break it down, and we have the whole list of concepts in there, like spatial containment and ownership history tracking. And we just break it down step by step and certify bit by bit. And I guess just like the validation, which I proposed before, this is not new. This is a commonly used solution. This kind of broken down certification is quite common when you have a complex feature-rich spec. So here's caniuse.com. This is for the web spec, which includes like HTML5 and CSS and so on. So this lets you search, because there are thousands of these web-based standard features, and you search for it and it'll tell you whether a vendor is compatible. And the tool also works from the user side. They can upload, here they upload a website or something like that, but I guess we would upload an IFC, and it will tell you whether or not different browsers, or in this case for us it would be different vendors, can consume or interact with that IFC. So here's an example. We're checking out a single feature in the web. You get some traffic lights and some version statuses, and this will solve the version lag problem we have as well. But more importantly, at the bottom, you'll see there's notes, these known issues, resources, and feedback. And this is incredibly useful because it's incredibly complex for a user which doesn't have deep IFC knowledge to set up IFC and exports correctly. There's this endless guides and document, just so much online trying to teach this. But if the Building Smart certification process was accessible to a user and linked to the immediately relevant software help guide, this would probably ensure that users get a much smoother experience. So here's a similar prototype that was built for IFC. It doesn't work, but it's a UI. You can select, well, as in the web thing doesn't work, it works on the desktop. You can select a category of a feature you're interested in. It's grouped by a stakeholder or a domain-based workflow, and it's translated into multiple languages. This uses Gherkin. We'll get some vendor traffic lights, which you see here, as well as automatic online testing for that feature. And it's accompanied by the series of guides and notes and version metadata. And so here's a basic one for basic project metadata, which you can see here. And it's accompanied with a guide that says, okay, here's where you do it in different software. Here's another one showing for georeferencing. And you can see this is really user focused. It's not vendor focused. It distinguishes between imports and exports very clearly, versions, and it goes into a huge amount of detail in the guides. A single geolocation guide is over 1,000 words long, and it has pictures and step by step, and what happens if it's 2x3, what if it's 4, and this is simple stuff, fairly straightforward stuff. But I think breaking down certification into these manageable concepts and accompanying those concepts with user documentation are really the best way to make certification meaningful to users. Behind the scenes, these concepts are based on a syntax known as Gherkin. This is Gherkin, for those, is basically unit tests that use a natural human language. And there's some basic rules to it. You start with the name of the feature of what you're certifying up here. It's got short 3 sentences saying the stakeholders, as well as who it's relevant to and what workflow it's relevant for. It's just arbitrary text. There's nothing magic about this. Some pattern matching. There's nothing complex about it. And the feature is broken down into different scenarios. And each scenario correlates to a portion of a workflow you might be experiencing. And then the scenario breaks down into individual facets of IFC data, which you can certify. And this is the level of granularity I'm talking about. And this allows projects to understand exactly what the certification means to them. What data does it exactly apply? What data can they get out of it? So I guess this turns into this dictionary of all these sentences, of course, translates into different languages of features and workflows supported by IFC. And I think as we see this kind of more native IFC and this accessibility of this user-driven technology, we will also then start seeing this need for decentralized certification from individual chapters, individual countries or governments, individual companies, individual projects, or even the individuals themselves. And they'll come up with their own software requirements. So we're already seeing this trend. I mean, the MVD database on Building Smart already lists many informal non-BSI MVDs. We'll probably see this increase with time. So if we break down the certification process earlier into smaller chunks, when this time comes, we'll probably be ready to ensure that the quality of IFC data is still there. I'll talk a little bit about Gherkin. Anyone in the audience who's a Ruby programmer, you probably used it before. Here are some of the keywords it uses, and it's just a way of breaking down or discipline of categorizing your scenarios or features that you're testing. And there's nothing technically different about it. It's just a semantic thing. I'd like to highlight 3 of these: is given, when, and then keywords. Basically lets you write 3 sentences, given such and such a scenario, when the user interacts with it in this way, then this is the output that will occur. So this is a tried and proven technology for writing a high-level full-stack usability test, which has a really big integration with business users. And especially as native IFC authoring becomes a thing, we may start requiring certification for this native authoring. And users need to guarantee that when they modify or author IFCs or portions of an IFC, this will result in a valid or expected change, especially because the IFC graph, as we all know, is extremely complex. This is a tried and proven system. It's used in the software world. I guess it's one opportunity to apply it strategically. So I think we're living in a time of change in IFC right now. The industry is slowly learning about IFC, not as a translation, but as a native schema. And many tools are emerging to author it directly. So kind of to prevent this ecosystem that will emerge from turning out like the Wild West, hopefully I've raised some ideas about how certification could be used to address that. But I'd like to share just one more fun little thing, which I think is a good complement. Some of you may know this. This is known as the Web Interoperability Pledge. And this is early when the global web standards were being formed. Many vendors implemented the standard, but they had a flavor to their implementation. So interoperability didn't quite work the way it should. And we're seeing some similar patterns repeating with IFC right now. There's some vendor-specific IFC import and export guides. These guides really shouldn't exist. Really, it should just be, this is what IFC says. I mean, we just do it the IFC way. And this pledge is supported by all entities, small and large. And what it says is that I pledge to follow standards and to base all my data and my workflows on standards only. And this is another tool that complements certification, because certification is a bit of a top-down process. This is more of a bottom-up, where users pledge to adopt a workflow and methodology that only uses OpenBIM standards. And I think maybe a pledge like this, just a fun suggestion, if it's started to be adopted by firms, it may help provide a secondary guarantee to a client or a government or a private sector that the general, or even the general public, that our digital built environment will truly deliver on the promise of OpenBIM, instead of what we have right now, which sadly is this copy-pasted contractual sentence, which is a checkbox exercise. Okay, that was a bit of a spiel. That's it for me today. I hope I've raised some awareness, especially from the user perspective, how users look at certification, and potentially brainstorm some solutions that could help, or what other organizations are doing. So thank you very much for having me today, and I guess I'll watch the comments.